Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Social and Emotional Wellbeing of Children and Youth webinar today. It's really great to have everyone online, and I really hope you enjoy the lineup of speakers that we have ready for you today. Just like to say briefly that Gay Dewey Proud Spirit Australia is really thrilled to be organising and supporting these webinars. So Gay Dewey is a national Indigenous or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health leadership group, and we're a fairly new organisation, but we've been around for a few years now, and we really hope to change the landscape around mental health and social and emotional wellbeing, and really take our knowledge and our understanding from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective forward into the future so that we can improve the outcomes for our kids and our families and our communities. So a little bit about me. I'm Helen Milroy. I'm a Palku woman. My mob are from the Pilbara region in Western Australia, so that's kind of like Marble Bar down to Nullagine. Beautiful, beautiful country. Lots of purple hues in the landscape, but one of the hottest places in Australia. So if you're going to come and visit my country, please come in winter. Fortunately for me, though, I was actually born on the wonderful lands of the Whadjuk Noongar Budja here in Perth in Western Australia. And so before we get any further down the track, I'd like to just acknowledge all of the homelands on which we're meeting today, pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and really thank our ancestors for their beautiful custodianship of these lovely lands that we get to work and play and raise our children in, and thank them for their ongoing contribution to our society. So today's webinar, we will hear from professionals and academics in social and emotional wellbeing of children and youth that will discuss issues and challenges for our wellbeing, as well as prioritising early interventions and supportive policies where we can create environments that foster healthy social and emotional development and thereby positively impacting the wellbeing of children and youth. And of course, I think we all know that one of our biggest priorities in life is to bring about the wellbeing of our children, and we know that in turn they will do the same for all of our future generations. And thank you, Gay Dewey, and everyone behind the scenes for hosting these webinars on these very important issues for our mobs. So our speakers today include Catherine Chamberlin, PhD. Kath is a Professor of Indigenous Health and an NH and MRC Career Development Fellow at the Centre for Health Equity, University of Melbourne, and a fabulous researcher in the area of perinatal health for our mob. Dr. Paul Gray, who leads the Indigenous Child Protection Hub at UTS in Jumbunna Institute of Indigenous Education and Research, and Paul is a psychologist by background and also an excellent speaker. Dr. Marshall Watson is a Distinguished Fellow of the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. He's a fellow child and adolescent psychiatrist, but he has also specialised in forensic mental health. So a great combination, because certainly we know that some of the juvenile detention centres have a lot of our young people in them. And so Marshall, I'm sure, will give an excellent presentation about some of those issues. So that's enough for me. You'll hear from me a little bit later in the program, but I really hope you enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Kath Chamberlin. I'm a Palawa-Traway woman from the northeast coast of Tasmania. I'm a midwife and director of ANEMDA Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health and Wellbeing at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. And thank you so much for the invitation and opportunity to come along and talk to you today. It's a real privilege to come and share some of what we've been learning working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and community-controlled organisations over the last 5 years or so to co-design strategies to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families experiencing complex trauma. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm calling in today from the lands of the Wurundjeri country in Naarm, Melbourne, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I want to extend that to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining here today, and to everybody who is joining today and working with families at such an incredibly important time during, becoming a parent, the transition to becoming a parent, the most important role that any of us have in our lives. In the next 25 minutes, I'd like to cover 3 main things. First of all, talk about the importance of pregnancy and the first couple of years after birth in addressing intergenerational trauma and improving health across the life course. It's a fundamental foundation for closing the gap, and my background's in public health, so I'm really focusing on that today from a public health perspective. I'd like to share some evidence from communities about how we can help to heal the past by nurturing the future, and talk a bit about a project that we've started recently to scale up these learnings with those from other projects to transform cycles of intergenerational trauma and hurt to intergenerational cycles of nurturing and recovery, which we've called this project Replanting the Birthing Trees, to represent the safe and sacred place that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have sought for millennia at this important time. So just as a bit of background to this project, I'm a midwife, mother of 2 lovely adult sons now, and a public health researcher, and I spent the first decade or so of my career looking at things in like smoking and diabetes in pregnancy, which are really important public health issues. But in looking at, what we can do to support families with diabetes and who smoke, it just became increasingly apparent that this complex and intergenerational trauma is driving persistent health inequalities and also having a big impact on people's physical health. And I know a lot of people joining this, with all the great work that you do through the Guai Turai project, are real experts in mental health and wellbeing, and so it's no surprise to you that mental health has an impact on all health, but that's something that we're really trying to bring together in this work. So I've just added this project image from Shawana Andrews, which literally underpins all of our work and the aspirations of the project team. A father, mother and child are wearing possum skin cloaks and looking to the ancestors and past generations. The parents are connected with a songline which gives them strength. The stones below represent a strong foundation, and the stitching on the cloak represents the relational connectedness of Aboriginal people and worldviews. And there's a huge number of people that are working on this together, working on all of this that I'm presenting today. As you know, before we start any discussions talking about trauma, it's important to be mindful that this affects many of us personally as well as professionally, and that these can trigger responses to things that might have happened for you in the past. And this can come up and be experienced as fear, panic, vulnerability, or feeling disconnected. And I've shared some practical slides here and tips from Professor Judy and Carly Atkinson from the Wee Ali Foundation to think about, if you're having these experiences, some strategies to ground yourself, and just to remember that these are all normal responses and an opportunity for growth and healing. So first, just a bit about understanding intergenerational trauma and the impact on communities. And it's always important that when we start this discussion that we frame it by remembering that prior to colonisation, there's a lot of evidence that the health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people was better than non-Indigenous people at the time. Our communities have thrived and adapted in this country, Australia, for at least 60,000 years. And the health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around the time of colonisation, just 200 years ago, was, a lot better than Europeans, certainly better than the Europeans who arrived here by boat. And this wasn't accidental. This state of wellbeing, which was centred around connectedness, it didn't happen. It happened because of policies and practices that we had in place. We had over 500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander countries, each with laws and systems and practices and ways of being, and a thriving art and spiritual culture. We weren't sending our kids off to work in mines or off to harsh boarding schools. It was happening to a lot of other kids at that time. And the safety and relational development of our children was being fostered within these systems of kinship and community care for millennia. We had specific practices that started from before birth and singing to babies around the time of birth, with really focused strategies to help foster connectedness to each other, to family, to kin, to community, to our country, to our ancestors. And of course, babies are our gift from the ancestors, as we know. So this is all depicted here in this well-known model by Dr. Graham G and colleagues here, and it started from before birth and it continues right throughout life until after death. And it's really important to think about this in relation to complex trauma when we're talking about it, because it's often called relational or developmental trauma. And at its core, it disrupts these important connections that we know are essential to well-being. And, there's really a lot, this is a lot that the world can learn from one of the world's oldest continuing cultures to share about ways to foster connectedness and well-being. And boy, do we need this right across the world right now. We need it, but this is something important for all communities to start to understand. So I just want to talk a little bit about what's happened in the past 200 short years that's led to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people going from having, among the best to the worst health in the world. First of all, which is really important for me as an academic, our systems of knowledge that underpin those thriving, the knowledge around connectedness and well-being, it's been suppressed. And even things like the use of language and cultural practices to foster well-being have been forbidden, often with the most horrendous threats of removing children from families for practicing, speaking language or practicing culture, and breaching those imposed colonial rules. It's really akin to what was happening in the Middle Ages in Europe before the Renaissance, with the burning of books and the suppression of really important knowledge. And simultaneously at that time, the knowledge was being generated about us by non-Indigenous researchers, predominantly, informed by assumptions of knowledge superiority and not reflecting assuming that our knowledge was inferior. And then we've got this distorted knowledge base that's been generated by research that's been used to inform all of our health programs, train all of our healthcare professionals. And it's a huge challenge for us working in research and in academic institutions at the moment to try and rectify that and refocus and get an accurate and unblurred lens on what are actually our health issues, and the knowledges, bringing back our knowledges to actually underpin social emotional well-being. And then secondly, of course, which we people talk a lot more about, is we know about the successive waves of violence associated with colonisation, starting with direct conflict and overt violence, then the covert violence and all the structural attacks, which have been directly on our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, with really devastating policies, including the stolen generations, the forced separation of families, forbidding people to connect once they'd left the reservations and things like that. So, children, we knew that a lot of this happened in hospitals from even shortly after birth, and still happens today, which is a real challenge for those of us that are working in pregnancy and birth and around this time, because this is the legacy that we're working within, and it's still very much a live issue. It feels like the front line very much of the colonial wars in Australia have been on our families, and we're trying to be, we're meant to be supporting families as health services during these times, but it's the health service itself sometimes where some of these structural attacks and disruptions of families is taking place. So it's important to note that this is not something that this knowledge about intergenerational trauma that's come up in the last couple of years is not something that's just impacting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. Complex trauma is a worldwide public health issue that people are talking about. The World Health Organization estimates that 25 to 50% of all children experience some form of child maltreatment. And this image from the British Medical Journal in 2020 highlights the effects of war on children in Europe, and the effects that start in utero and then cross through the range of impacts through child health and well-being that cause toxic stress. And then if it's repeated and prolonged, it can lead to complex trauma, physical, social, emotional challenges through to adulthood, which can then have intergenerational effects due to the impact on relational development and the capacity to nurture children. And of course, Professor Judy Atkinson's seminal work, Trauma Trials, describes the impact of this on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And I know that you've all learnt a lot about this, and this is a core part of your work. Importantly, I'm a public health researcher, and just as an epidemiologist, I wanted to emphasise that there's a huge amount of epidemiological data that shows how these individual effects play out at a population level. And we're seeing this compounding intergenerational effect today, and that's what we're dealing with some of the really challenging issues that we're dealing with in some communities. So we know that historical violence has led to increased rate of direct exposure to violence, and including child maltreatment. And when those initial exposures happen in early childhood, there are things that can either make them better or worse throughout life, as many of you know. And a lot of the circumstances that people are living in compound and can make those early life adversities worse. We know that all of this leads to increased health risks. We've seen that with the adverse childhood experiences studies that have shown worldwide the devastating health impacts of early adversity in life. And not only does it increase health risks, like 25% of smoking, for example, can be attributed to early adversity, about 15% of obesity in the UK, but as well as those increased health risks, it also the strategies that we have to prevent and address those issues don't work as well for people with trauma because of the neurophysiological effects of trauma. Then importantly, which we're going to be talking about today, there's the intergenerational effects and how critical this is to, such a critical time during pregnancy and birth to really transform this and turn it around. And what we see is this increasing effect on health inequalities as exposure to the violence concentrates and reverberates within some communities and not in others. So we're starting to get inequalities not just between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Australia, but also between communities and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities ourselves. So it's really important that we all work together on this to address it. So this compounding effect is really clearly illustrated with the ever-increasing rates of children that we're seeing overrepresented in the child protection system, and we know this is also reflected in the justice systems. These are core closing the gap indicators that all Australian governments have committed to addressing. And you can see here in this slide that the problem's getting worse. It's an absolute crisis. In 2000, and you can see the top line is where we're actually heading with the number of children in out-of-home care. This is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Down the bottom is non-Indigenous children, and this black line, which is not even very ambitious, is we are nowhere near it. So we really do need to do things differently if we're going to be turning this around. But clearly the current system isn't working, and these are catastrophic outcomes for these kids in out-of-home care. One study showed that nearly 40% of children leaving out-of-home care had attempted suicide within 4 years of leaving in New South Wales. And every one of those children, these are children and not numbers, and everyone is an absolute tragedy. So that's sort of where we are, but now I want to really focus on why this time around pregnancy and birth is absolutely critical for addressing these really difficult issues, and why your work is really important in supporting families, and why we all need to work together. So there's three main reasons. Firstly, there's this convergence of risk factors for experiencing trauma-related stress during the time around pregnancy and birth in the early years. It's almost like a natural stress test. So we have, you can have pre-existing vulnerability to mental illness. There's the historical trauma, increased risk of family violence at this time. People can have housing instability and financial insecurity. People can be increasingly socially isolated because of the changes in their social circumstances. There can be previous birth trauma that can get stirred up. There's racism, experiences of racism that people can have. We have lateral violence within our own communities. And then you throw in sleep deprivation and all the hormonal changes that happen naturally at this time that make us more highly sensitive to trauma responses, with those fright, flight and freeze responses that you know about. That, if people are going to be experiencing trauma-related distress, they're more likely to experience it now than at any other time in their life. And because of the effects of freezing, that can actually cause a lot of problems with their care as well. So if people are getting angry, having the fight response, that can obviously be really troublesome during that time. If people are avoiding care, not turning up to antenatal care appointments, and also if people are freezing and not understanding what is happening at the time when they're needing to understand a lot of information that they're being given, it can really cascade and cause a sort of spiraling downward problem if it's not understood by the care providers what's happening and people provided the right support. But despite all of that, the really exciting thing about reading the research in this area is that despite all of the issues, it's the best time in the whole lifetime to disrupt the cycle of trauma. And this is through the love. We call love is definitely the healing salve of trauma. And babies come into the world wanting to attach and connect. And we know that it's that connectedness and the attachment and the love that is the healing. And it can help to rewire the brain, there's some of those trauma responses in the brain, and set up a positive reinforcing cycle where, the more nurturing that the baby gets, the more attachment and all of the better connection. And that can really help to heal. And there's actually a lot we know about how important it is for the baby's brain at this time and how much neuroplasticity there is. An important time for baby's development is absolutely critical that they get that nurturing care. But also now we're learning a lot that there's a lot of neuroplasticity of parents during this time and a lot of opportunity there for brain, for recovery and healing as well. So we really want to make sure that we can do this, and that's why we called this project Healing the Past by Nurturing the Future, because that's, literally what happens. And we know that now from the neurophysiology and all the science as well as what our ancestors knew for a long time. The other thing, of course, is that it's the first time that people had frequent scheduled contact with with care providers since childhood. These are healthy young people. They don't usually go to health services. So we want to make sure that these are positive and not negative and healing. So we know that most people working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents actually know all this. So there's a survey in 2015 by COPE asking perinatal care providers how significant do they think trauma, stress and grief are for families. 98% said significant or very significant, yet unfortunately 43% don't feel satisfied that their organisations can provide support for families. So this is really what we're trying to work on here and what we all need to work together to provide better support for families and better support for carers working with families as well. So there's a load of research here. I'm not going to be able to go through too much of it today, but I've got references on the bottom of all the slides and really happy to share anything that you'd like. We've got this project Healing the Past by Nurturing the Future that was a 4-year co-design and now a pilot implementation project that brings together emerging Western evidence and millennia-old wisdom of communities to co-design acceptable, safe and feasible strategies to support families experiencing trauma. And we started with a workshop where we developed this conceptual model around 4 key domains. First of all is having trauma awareness, that's in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health plan, having practical support for families and thinking broadly about support, having safe recognition. So we're a bit anxious about having accurate assessment tools, even though we have worked on one, but we really want to make sure that any sort of assessment of complex trauma is done safely and doesn't cause more harm than good. And that's been the elephant in the room for us with this project, has been the intersection with child protection services and worrying that at the moment that is just not happening. That support is not being provided in a trauma-informed way and often causing more harm than good. So we're working through at the moment, you can see we've done the steps 1 to 4 of this intervention mapping model, which is a participatory ecological design model. And we're at the moment working on step 5 and 6 in partnership with some communities. So I'll just briefly share some of the key findings here from the co-design phase, and there's all papers that you can read loads more about it here, but after a scoping review, we've done this comprehensive literature review that looks at the views and experiences of parents in maternity and early childhood care during pregnancy, birth, and post-birth, sorry. It included 27 studies with 351 parents around the world. Most are from the US and about 20 were Indigenous. So this review describes positive experiences and hopes for the future associated, of becoming a parent. Many parents also describe lots of challenges at multiple levels. And importantly, they describe things that really help with what they're currently doing and to help them heal and nurture their family. And that was really the thing, that most people are just doing this on their own at the moment. So 7 broad themes really emerged from looking at all of these experiences of families, including the importance of this being an opportunity for new beginning and a fresh start, and the changing roles and identity during this important role of transition, the importance of feeling connected, the relationships with self, baby and others having really major impacts on people's experiences, the critical importance of compassionate care, kindness and empathy that I'll come back to, the importance of empowerment, control, choice and having a voice are really critical for people experiencing trauma, because of course the cause of that is lack of control and not having choice. The importance of creating safety. So people perceiving, parents experiencing trauma often perceive the world as unsafe. And so having conscious strategies in the care about how do we create that safe and sacred place, like the birthing tree that we'll talk about in a minute, and the relationships to protect themselves and their family. And there was this lovely analogy that one person made around families reweaving a future together, managing the challenges that they're having and healing while also becoming a parent and sort of weaving back and the complex process that was. We had a workshop here around, we did ask in Alice Springs, we had this fantastic workshop with around 70 people, and we asked people, should we even talk to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents about trauma? Is it going to be too much? Is it safe? Can we do that? Should we be doing that? And there was consensus from that group that these are discussions that we should try to have with families, but that there's a whole lot of criteria here that need to be met to be able to make sure that these discussions are safe. First of all, that there's emotional, physical and cultural safety clearly established, not, with the tick box on the first visit at the antenatal visit like we have sometimes at the moment. Having a trusting relationship with the person talking about trauma is absolutely critical. The person who is having that discussion needs to be able to respond, have the skills to actually respond effectively and deal with what can be fairly confronting things that might come up, and be able to hold that space safely and have the time to listen and the skills to be able to provide the right support. The importance of incorporating cultural methods of communicating gently. So the communities, our elders like Auntie Miriam Rose, Elder of the Year, with her strategies around Dadiri and deep listening, using yarning and storytelling are really great examples of indirect methods that can gently and safely help people to understand the effects of trauma, and without it being too direct and inquisitive. These are real strategies that we need to learn more about and use more effectively in this space, and can be really helpful in this space. So using, and I know Helen Milroy's talked a lot about storytelling and some other work that we've done, and really I think it's a huge important role for all of that in this work. The use of strength-based approaches and offering choices, and also respect, caring and compassion, which comes up over and over again in everything that we've done. We've had another workshop on where we asked can perinatal services actually safely identify Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents experiencing trauma? And if so, how can we do that? And the 6 essential elements here were identified from the thematic analysis. So these were holistic care, cultural and social emotional safety, empowerment, choice and control, and flexible centred care, trusting relationships. You can see there's a lot of consistent themes here going on and on. And importantly, in terms of spaces, we asked people in this workshop what it is what does actually a trauma-aware service look like? And there were 4 overarching themes here. So having authentic partnerships that were nurtured and invested in to provide the foundations for care, having a really skilled workforce there, having empowering and compassionate care again to enable trust, and having safe, accessible environments to facilitate engagement. We do use a lot of stories when we've been having these discussions as a way of having those sensitive discussions safely, as we said. And here in this paper, we asked families we shared a story about a family, a fictional story, and then we asked parents to reflect on the story, the parents in the story, and talk to us about the things that might be impacting families from the past, the roots, the things that might be keeping them strong, the trunk, what would help them achieve their hopes and dreams, or what are their hopes and dreams, the branches, and then what would help them achieve their hopes and dreams, which were the leaves and flowers and things, and included reflective themes from the review. And here I just wanted to again share another one of Shawanna's drawings. So we found from this description of parents, they described how there were 3 interdependent elements. So parents' connectedness, parents' wellbeing, and the knowledge and skills in the transition to being a parent, those 3 things. So connectedness, wellbeing, and transitioning to being a parent. And any negative impact on any one of those impacted negatively on the other 2, or conversely, could be a positively reinforcing effect as well. So it's that positive or negatively reinforcing interdependency that's key. And that's why we get more bang for our buck when we really invest in this time, because it impacts positively on a lot more things than we initially imagined. So Shawanna's drawn another description here that I'll just read out. So the grasses, weave and basket represent the cumulative nature of connectedness, wellbeing and parenting respectively. The grasses or reeds from which the basket's made grow from country and represent connectedness to place and culture. And the weave facilitates the grasses' transformation into a basket and relies on the generational transferred Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges and cultural practice. Without knowing how to weave, a basket cannot be made, and the well-being of culture and community kinship networks are represented here. The basket is the product of cumulative knowledges and practices and is only whole and effective when all of the prior stages are achieved. So I might whip through some of this because I'm probably running a little bit out of time, but and this is a bit hard to read, but essentially we asked people all the stuff they were doing, and my gosh, there's a lot of amazing stuff that people are doing out there. So we've tried to collate it into goals, and essentially there's a lot of different ways to achieve the same ends, and but there were some key elements and goals that people were trying to achieve. So culture, having the relationship and connectedness, the safety and the timing of being available when needed were some of the critical elements for all of the support strategies. But there's a range of different support goals here around resilience, connectedness, training, practical assistance, self-care, and enabling access to support and having the healing and therapeutic approaches. So the critical things here that came up were around the importance of hope, and this is, how do we have these hope-inspiring services? How do we inspire hope in the care and support that we provide at that time? And hope is really important to be thinking about. So it's a way of thinking that pushes us to action. And research finds that when people have hope, we're more likely to make our goals a reality. And when we have a clear belief and a clear hope, it's about what's possible, and we're more likely to be able to actually achieve those goals. So really important to be thinking about in how we provide care. And again, I cannot emphasize the importance of compassion and caring. I often get people say, you know, feeling overwhelmed by the scale of some of the issues that we're facing in communities, but you know, compassion and caring is a superpower, and it may be that it doesn't feel like you're doing much by being caring and compassionate, but it really, really means a lot. And it can make people, it really impacts on people's sense of value and self-worth, and just to remember that at all times. And I'll just briefly mention this new project that we're scaling up from some of this work and learning, which is around replanting the birthing trees. And I've got a story there which Valerie Archie, the artist, our artist, has drawn. And you can see there the sort of darker colour on the left moving over, which represents some of the colonial past and hardship that we've been through, but really popping into the bright vibrancy of communities and the hope and joy and what we want to see with the rebuilding and the revitalisation and life of the communities. And so we've used this title of replanting the birthing trees, as I said, because birthing trees represent a safe and sacred place that women have sought for millennia. And we really want to recreate that within the care that we can provide around these important 2,000 days. This is the conceptual model. So it brings together it's informed by rigorous research and practice evidence and grounded in our ancient Indigenous knowledges and worldviews. And there's 6 work streams there that are being developed that align with the healing the past. I'm just separating them out a little bit more into the tree, but having a whole work stream for the supporting Aboriginal families to stay together from the start, the intersection with child protection services. And each one of these work streams are led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander early mid-career researchers to sort of build up the next generation as well. So Jacinta Cracker's leading the Strong Roots section. There's a whole lot of evidence around continuity of care with Storm Henry leading that work. There's a whole lot of work around the workforce development and the strong branches, which is Associate Professor Carly Atkinson leading all that work. And then we've got assessment tools, evidence-based support, and the resource repository as well to try and put all this stuff. This is all the people. There is so many people. This is an absolutely massive project, and I'm embarrassed. I don't even think I've got everybody listed here, but there is a lot of people involved, 47 investigators, 17 partner organisations, and many more that are involved as friends and supporters. So and the important thing about this work is that it's governed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak bodies, and the chair of that group is Arnie Dosena Fergie, and we report to that group so that it's a community, putting it all back to community. So thank you for listening. In summary, this is a really critical time for addressing intergenerational trauma. Really great to be able to talk to you today. We know we can heal the past by nurturing the future if we all work together, and we're really keen to work with everyone on how we can replant those birthing trees, transform systems to better support families. And there's some more information there. Thank you again.
Hello everyone, glad to be back with you. I hope you really enjoyed Catherine's talk, and I'm now going to speak about mental health issues for kids, and this title is called Born into Stories, and it's about the social emotional wellbeing of our children into the future. For some of you who didn't see the introduction, I'm Helen Milroy. I'm a Palku woman from the Pilbara region in Western Australia, and I'm also the chairperson of Gaia Dewey, and professionally I'm a professor of child and adolescent psychiatry in Perth. So let's get into it. So this is my mob in the Pilbara there. That X marks the spot on that map. And that's my grandmother's country. Beautiful country, but I've been also fortunate to live on Wajak Noongar Budja here in Perth, and that's also a very beautiful country. So just to start off with, to really ground us in understanding well-being, it really comes from a generational approach. So if we think about it, a lot of how we are in life, the things that we learn about, how we manage, really comes from our families and our generations. So from my perspective, this is my grandmother holding my mum, and then my mum holds me and I hold my child. And that's in some respects how parenting and well-being is passed down through the generations. Unfortunately, for a lot of our families, that line and that ancestry and heritage has been disrupted through the process of colonisation and all the things that happened historically. But if we can restore those connections and restore that generational well-being, that will hold us in good stead for the future. So I'm just going to start this session off with a story just to ground ourselves in the notion of storytelling, which is one of the key concepts that I also want to talk about in this presentation about children and also for our well-being. So this is called Mudlark and Son. When Mudlark was a fluffy little chick just out of the nest, she loved rolling in the mud and playing in the mud pool. Sometimes she would play all day, but by late afternoon the mud pool would be cold. Mudlark would shiver and her beak would make a funny chattering noise. "What's that strange sound?" said Son one day. "It's me," said Mudlark. "I'm freezing." Son looked down, but all he saw was a ball of mud. Mudlark wiped the mud off her face. "See?" she said. Son laughed at the little bird. "I will warm you up," he said, and he did. From then on, Mudlark and Son became good friends. However, one day the Son started to become angry. He woke up angry and went to bed angry and was fiery all day long. This kept happening day after day, and it was getting worse. He was so angry he wouldn't go to bed, and the days were getting longer and longer. All the animals were getting very tired. There was too much light and heat to sleep, and they were worried one day that Son might set the whole landscape on fire. They didn't know what to do. The water was disappearing, and even Mudlark's favourite mud pool was turning to dust. Something had to be done. The days had become so hot the animals had to live underground. Son hadn't always been like this. He used to be the best son in the universe. Something must have happened, thought Mudlark, as Son was one of Mudlark's best friends. Mudlark felt sorry for Son. "It can't be very nice for anyone to be feeling that angry all the time," said Mudlark to all the animals. "Perhaps I should try and talk to him." "You do that," said the animals. "We are fed up and want Son to go away," they said angrily. Mudlark kept her distance from Son as she didn't want to get her feathers singed from the heat. "Son," she called out, "Son!" Son wasn't listening, and solar flares kept firing off all over the sky, sometimes leaving hot burning coals on the ground. Mudlark threw mud pies at the Sun to get his attention, but as soon as they got close, they were burnt into dust and blew away on the breeze. Mudlark decided she needed to find out more about Sun. That night, Mudlark went to talk to Sun's oldest friend, the Moon. "Do you know why Sun is so angry?" she asked Moon. "Well, he has always had a hot temper, you know," said Moon, "but I don't know what's wrong with him. He keeps making me wait later and later to rise in the evening, and then he gets up very early. Sun was always determined, but he never used to be this bossy. He's behaving like a naughty little boy," said Moon. "I don't know what to do, but I'm very worried. There is one thing that might be important, though. He was visited by Comet, his cousin, some time ago. Maybe Comet knows what is wrong," Moon added. "Thank you," said Mudlark. "But how am I going to find Comet?" she asked. Comet only visited the Earth every few years. She had no idea where he would be now. "Maybe I could ask the stars. They stretch for miles and are always gossiping about what is going on across the universe. They might know where he is," said Moon. The stars sent out a message out through the constellations throughout the cosmos, and soon everyone was chattering about Comet. It didn't take long for Comet to hear what was happening, so he quickly turned around to pay Mudlark a visit. Mudlark woke with a startle to a bright light hovering overhead. Mudlark and Comet talked for a while. Comet had known Sun since the beginning of time. When the universe was created, there were so many children of the Sun parents there was no time for play. The little Earth Sun was always worried and had trouble getting to sleep. Everybody was concerned he would burn up the whole universe. His grandmother, however, adored him and would often tell him stories and play games to teach him how to be a good Earth son. She even wrote him a special lullaby which she sang to him every night to help him settle and create the most beautiful sunsets before going to bed. He really loved his grandmother. "When I visited recently," said Comet, "I had to tell Sun some very bad news. His grandmother had set for the last time, and he was heartbroken." "Now I understand," said Mudlark. "But can you teach me the lullaby?" she asked. Mudlark and Comet practiced the lullaby all night until she sang it just right. The next day was so hot no one could go outside at all, so Mudlark rested until late in the afternoon. Mudlark was very careful in her planning as she wanted to make sure she always protected herself. Mudlark gathered up her last bit of water to make sure she had some mud and covered herself all over with a thick coating. Sun was at the edge of the earth but was refusing to set. Mudlark ran towards Sun, covered in her mud coat, so she could get as close as possible without getting burnt. Mudlark started singing the lullaby as loud as she could. Sun stopped immediately when he heard the song and just listened. The fiery flame started to dissipate and the harsh light softened. The temperature started falling and suddenly the rain clouds rolled across the sky. The rain poured out all over the land, filling the rivers and lakes and the mud pools. All the animals came out to see what was happening. Mudlark stood fast and kept singing. As the storm passed over, Mudlark was finishing the last verse of the song. All the mud had washed off Mudlark's face and feathers, and Mudlark glistened with the raindrops as they rolled off her back. The sun looked down. "It was you singing, Mudlark," said the sun with great joy. "Yes," said Mudlark. Comet taught me the song last night." "I am so sorry about your grandmother," Mudlark said, with great sadness and compassion in her voice. "I was trying to be strong and hide my grief," said Sun, "but I didn't realize what I was doing. The rain were the tears. The rain were my tears for my grandmother." "It's okay," said Mudlark. "We don't always understand or know what to do with our feelings, but you can always talk to me," Mudlark said. Mudlark was still dripping wet and getting a bit cold, so Sun shone just a little bit brighter to warm her up, then cast a beautiful rainbow overhead. It was the most magnificent sunset the world had ever seen. All the animals were overjoyed to see Sun back to his usual self. "Thank you, Mudlark," they shouted. "Yes, thank you," said Sun. "You are a most extraordinary Mudlark." And from then on, every evening, and whenever Sun requested it, Mudlark would sing to Sun his grandmother's lullaby, and in return Sun warmed the mud pool for Mudlark so she could play happily all day. So I think what we have to understand about this story is that there's a lot of reasons why people can be distressed, why their social emotional well-being can be affected. But it starts very early in life. All of our experience that we have in childhood are so important in really helping us to understand how our well-being will be throughout our lifetime. So in order to understand adults, we actually have to be able to understand infants and children. And I think that's a really important message to understand. So if we look at the current situation in mental health, really not just for our children, but right across the lifespan, we're still very much focused on a deficit model. We're trying to fix what was broken. There's still a lot of racism in services. We've had some improvements, but the child context is particularly concerning. And in fact, if you look at any of the mental health data for our children, it's actually getting much worse and has been getting worse over 20 years, not just for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, but for children right throughout Australia. Mental health services is very variable. We have very few culturally safe services, and issues with cultural safety in general and collaborative models still haven't really been sorted out very well. We still rely far too heavily on a cognitive science and the sort of deficit model, rather than actually thinking about how we build resilience and strength and how we actually promote social and emotional well-being. So we really do need to make this shift of focus to strengths. We still don't incorporate what we know is really good, some of our ways of knowing, being and doing. Even storytelling, which is fundamental to child development, we still don't use enough in services. We need to have more decolonising approaches, and we still need to include more imagination and creativity in the way we go about our work with children in regard to social emotional well-being. So let's have a very brief look at Aboriginal health and the ways of knowing, being and doing that contribute to our well-being. I'm sure many of you have heard me speak about this before, so I'll probably go through this fairly quickly. So if we think about ways of knowing, we have a very ancient knowledge base. There's knowledge inscribed throughout the whole of the landscape, and there's a lot of wisdom that we have developed over many, many generations of living within the landscape. So it's the oldest knowledge base in the world. It's about resilience and survival. It's largely based on an observational method of science. We had an extensive pharmacopoeia. A lot of different sorts of medications were developed through natural remedies and through our bush medicines, which we still use today. We lived within a knowledge base that was in balance with nature. So there was always plenty, because it was the way that we incorporated that balance and harmony as an approach to life. We had extensive memory systems because we were an oral culture, nothing was written down, so everything had to be learnt and remembered. And that is a way to develop very extensive networks throughout the brain, which of course hold you in good stead for aging. A lot of our learning was through story and experience. And of course, the one of the things about storytelling, which I'll talk more to in a minute, is that storytelling allows us to develop insight in a way that's much gentler than always being given instructions and told what to do, which tends to be the approach in services as well when working with children. So actually developing insight for yourself that promotes autonomy is actually a much better way to learn. In terms of ways of doing, that's about how we go about developing our models of care, the way we looked after each other. We had models that were very much in balance. So this is one of my Dance of Life paintings, which talks about the idea of all the dimensions around you being in balance, and those dimensions are your physical health, your psychological and emotional health, your social and kinship structures and social systems, your spiritual and your cultural systems around you as well. And when all of those things are in balance and you're in balance with the universe, you can dance through life. So again, it's a model based on strength rather than deficit. So we had practice models where it was very inclusive, it was collaborative, multidimensional. Of course, they were culturally derived because they came from within our own cultural group. They were generational and relationship based, and of course everyone was included because everyone was family. And so there were no real exclusion criteria, and people would be looked after until they found the right remedies for whatever their issues were. In terms of ways of being, that's about how we are within the broader landscape. So rather than thinking of ourselves as owning everything or being the masters of the earth, we are seen very much as part of an ecological framework. So how do we exist within nature, within the universe, and within our own country? And so this is about a state of being. It's a wellbeing agenda. It's about connection and meaning and purpose, that interrelatedness of how we are. It is about how we fit within that ecological framework. So we don't own Mother Earth. We are part of Mother Earth. We are part of that ecological framework and system that allows us to be here for a time during our lifetime and to pass on that purpose and place and meaning onto future generations. As well, I think our way of being was about having a lot of autonomy and relatedness very early in life so that we were able to be self-reliant. That allowed us, I think, a lot of sustainability and endurance within a landscape, which changed over many, many generations, and we are still here. So if we think about attachment for our children, it was a much broader concept. It was not only attachment to family, but it was also attachment to culture and ancestry, as well as to totems and Mother Earth and to that ecological framework that we've already talked about. It was attachment to our dreaming stories, our spirituality, and in a sense, to be part of the landscape means that we can endure forever. So attachment wasn't something that was limited by our presence in this world, but it was continuous as part of our understanding of our culture. In terms of child rearing, that was we had very good child rearing practices. And in fact, it's interesting when we think about some of the evidence now that points to the best practices in parenting, they often come back to the things that we used to do innately as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in this country. So indulging infants in the first 2 years, allowing that mastery and omnipotence is something that now is seen as very good practice, that kids were grown up in very strong peer group attachments. They had early independence, and in fact, you'll hear a lot of Aboriginal kids talk about being their own boss, which was true. They were brought up to be very self-reliant, but that, of course, was within a very comprehensive and a very supportive kinship system. So the reason why this worked so well was because we had multiple primary attachment figures, a very, very gentle but very strong buffering of children who were then autonomous and self-reliant. When it doesn't work is when we break down those relationships in family and those kinship structures so that all you get is autonomy and self-reliance, and that doesn't work without that buffering. So making sure that those strong kinship systems surround the child, then self-reliance and early autonomy is definitely the way to go. Gender only became important in adolescence, and of course children were brought up based on that principle of obligation and reciprocity. So people looked after you, you looked after others. If they helped you out, you helped them out, and that's the way life was taught. In terms of communication, there was much less reliance on early language. It was more multimodal learning. kids were sort of taught about social relationships and skin groupings, which of course was some of the most important knowledge they could have, as well as creation stories, life lessons, navigating country, all of those sorts of things. So learning was often experiential, but it was also buffered by stories, by ceremony, by kinship rules, by other sorts of aspects of culture that help support the child's development. As I said before, we were an oral culture, so of course kids developed extensive memory systems very early on in life. And as we learn more about neurodevelopment, the establishment and the pruning that occurs in those first couple of years of life, it's really important that we have those extensive networks developed so that when that pruning occurs, we actually save the most important neural networks, which of course are things like life lessons and that ability for early autonomy. So in terms of the way we would understand social emotional being generally is that it's interconnected, it's multidimensional, it includes an understanding of the past, the present and the future, it's strength-based, it builds connections and it allows for those stay strong plans. Within that, we can look at mental illness or distress or other sorts of mental health challenges, but it is primarily a strength-based approach as opposed to a deficit model, which we currently have in mental health services. So if we think about what's happened to children's mental health over the past 20 years, we have to understand that there's been a massive impact from the historical legacy. A cultural group cannot go through a genocide without having significant impacts on our family systems, our structures, as well as how we understand transgenerational trauma or intergenerational trauma. We've seen significant changes to family environments, to the issue of globalization. We have other things that have come on top of that historical legacy, including things like social media and technology. And of course, these are always a double-edged sword. So whilst some aspects of social media and technology can be good, we clearly see a lot of the negative aspects that also happen and the impact that that has on our children. There's issues around climate change, changes in our education systems, how we employ people, our policy and priorities as a nation. So all of these things combined together have really worsened our mental health. So even though we are a wealthy, well-developed nation with a lot of knowledge and technology, child mental health is getting worse. And we have to ask ourselves, what's happened? What's put children's well-being at risk over all of this time? So if we look at our particular population group in terms of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, this comes from the Bureau of Statistics, and it's in the lighter colour green is the Aboriginal population and the darker green represents the rest of Australia. And what we can see is that we have a lot of kids, which is fantastic because they're our future, but we have far fewer adults to go around to buffer those children and far less elders and older people that would form that grandparent role. So like I said before, bringing up kids with early autonomy and independence is great if you've got a well-buffered system. We don't have a normal population, and this is one of the legacies of genocide. We have to be able to grow our children really strong and healthy in the early years so that they can grow and develop and become parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, because it's only once we actually restore the whole population that we'll truly get well-being and the support that's required to establish our children's well-being early in life. We're nowhere near that yet. And I certainly plan now as a grandmother to make sure I buffer my daughters and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren going forward. So if we think about the historical legacy, it's left us with these three large components of trauma. So the first one is that powerlessness that we all experienced through history. So that lack of control that we had over our communities and our families. I'm not going to go into all the historical references here, but we know that that powerlessness was extreme. And one of the ways that we have to address that going forward is to make sure we have self-determination and we have good, strong community governance. The reason why this is really important for children is that if children can't see self-determination in their parents and their elders, how do they experience self-determination in themselves? What do they strive for if they don't see it within their own communities? So how do we develop self-determination in our children in a healthy way rather than them having to find out how to do it for themselves? In terms of the loss and grief that we all suffered, the actual sheer loss of life, as we can see from the population pyramid we've just looked at, but also the ongoing loss, because we still have, that sort of premature aging and premature diseases that people get. We have a shortened life expectancy. A lot of people are still missing sort of from our family system. So there's still a lot of loss and grief that's occurring at an early age. And for children, if you think that you're not going to live very long and you see people dying around you all the time, that tends to give you a sense of hopelessness about life in general. So what we really need to be able to do is make sure children are really well connected, that they have really strong community ties outside of their immediate families, so they can still see that strength and the idea that life continues on. And then the third component of trauma is just the interpersonal trauma that people experience. So I guess a lot of our people grew up in missions where there was a lot of trauma experience, both physical trauma, sexual abuse, as well as neglect. And these still occurs today, of course, in our communities. So that sort of level of trauma, that's what really builds the intergenerational trauma that people experience, that sense of helplessness that bad things are going to happen and they're going to continue to happen. And for children, what we need to be able to, how we need to be able to tackle that particular issue is through making sure they have the resilience to understand and to deal with adversity. We know that early adversity actually does contribute very, very strongly to our well-being. So to reduce the impact of early adversity, to make sure children are strong, that they have mastery, that they know how to do things. So this is where that self-reliance and early autonomy comes in as being really important, because if children feel capable at a young age, they're going to have agency at an older age, which means that they'll then take on personal responsibilities and have a much better ability to cope with life. So we've got a lot to do. Apart from all of that, we then have the impact of COVID in the last few years, which has had a significant impact on mental health. It's increased worry and anxiety in general. It's almost doubled eating disorders, and it's doubled a whole pile of other sorts of conditions that were already worsening prior to the pandemic. So when we think about all of that together, we've got trauma upon trauma upon trauma. So the COVID pandemic has created a global trauma that's been quite prolonged. That's also contributed to feelings of loss of control, of loss of personal freedoms, a lot of grief from death as well. We've also had that same powerlessness and helplessness and hopelessness that's come alongside that sort of COVID trauma. And of course, this is on the background of rising mental health challenges over 20 years. This is part of the understanding of why things aren't so good for our mobs today. I think the other thing that we also have to tackle with in terms of child mental health is it's hard to understand what mental health challenges are, particularly, say, in our younger children. I've had lots of people say to me, well, how would you know what a mental health challenge is as in an infant? Well, I'm telling you, you can actually see that, and you can see changes in infants' behaviour that shows that an infant is distressed. But I think there's these myths and these misunderstandings that children won't remember, that they'll be okay, that children are basically resilient. And some of that is true, except that we know children do remember. And even if they don't have it in full memory, they have it in other sorts of memory systems, such as visual memory or tactile memory or other sorts of memory systems that really contribute then to their well-being later on in life. So children may look okay, but they're often not. And we should not ignore all of the issues that are happening to our children right from birth and right throughout early child development. When we might see it hit the most is, of course, in adolescence, when they become suicidal and they develop self-harm behaviours, and that's when they really get paid attention. However, those things didn't just arise then. They were built on from earlier experiences much, much earlier in life, and that's when we should have been intervening. So most mental health challenges have their disorders or origins in childhood. By far, the adverse childhood experiences are the greatest risk. If we intervene early, then the cost effectiveness of that is much, much better. And for each generation of distressed youth, we must ask ourselves, well, how did they fare in their early years? What were their stories that led them to this path of distress as an adolescent? We should have been intervening much, much earlier in these pathways. And if we just quickly look at the ACEs research, we know that if you have lots of adverse childhood experiences early in life, you have major health, mental health, other sorts of issues right throughout life, including poor education, unemployment, drug and alcohol abuse, poor relationships, and it goes on and on and on. We're not doing enough. We also know, based on neuroscience, that the greatest capacity for recovery occurs earlier in life, not later in life. So it's cheaper and easier and more effective to intervene early than it is later on down the track. And for me, now at that other age end, probably not going to change me much at all these days. So some of the things that I've been doing in terms of understanding the impact of COVID as a global trauma, was thinking about what we could do for children that was a little bit different outside of perhaps the normal mental health treatment system. So this is where I found storytelling becomes even more important. So as our world feels like it's shrinking and we get confined to our homes and we don't have our normal structures, how do we get that relief from the anxiety and fear that everyone's experiencing? So I developed a series of books during this time where children could then focus in on that ecological framework which they're part of, embed them back into nature, and nature as a source of healing, allow them to focus on maybe who's in their backyard, what are the birds and animals and all of the natural things that live around them, to give them relief and time out from the worry. So as the world gets smaller and isolation increases, local connections and imaginations need to grow. And rather than give them counselling, what we need to do is give them reconnection. And I think sometimes we sort of miss the point and we focus on a sort of on a pathology as opposed to building resilience. So building connection for families, generational learning and wellbeing is good for everybody. And certainly I think if we can showcase how good that is for First Nations children and families, I think we'll find that it's actually good for all families. As well, we need to move from what is wrong with you to what has happened with you, understanding that trauma-informed response in mental health services, both for children, for families and for communities, creating safe journeys for people if they come into services, and reducing the re-traumatisation that so often occurs when children or families do come into our services. They want to feel safe if they seek help. They don't want to fear that their children are going to be removed because they're having problems. We must be able to make sure that our services feel safe and are safe when our families or communities approach systems for help. We also need to look back to culture and to our own ways of, as I said before, our own ways of being, doing and knowing. And there's some really good lessons that we can learn from that. So this is just a little story I wrote about healing from country. So when we go back to our homelands, when we reconnect with culture, when we reconnect with Mother Earth, when we reconnect back to that place where all of our ancestors are buried, where all of our ancestors are in the landscape, it's really powerful. It can make you feel connected above anything else that could ever happen. I know myself personally, when I've gone back to country and I stand on the land of my ancestors, I feel taller, I feel stronger, I feel proud, I feel connected. And that's what our children need. So as we walk across our sacred lands, Mother Earth has laid out these gifts. It's a never-ending source of renewal, recovery and rebirth. And hope, beauty, joy, peace, strength, gentleness, all of these things that we need in our lives for well-being can be gathered up as we walk through our homelands and our country. I think for a lot of our children, they miss being able to connect back to their homelands, their ancestral homelands. So with Indigenous storytelling, I think this is a really important part of recovery as well, and also to promote resilience for our children. In Indigenous storytelling, everything's interconnected, everything has spirit, everything's in relationship. You can sing to the moon, you can dance with the stars. It is essential to well-being, not just for children. It's actually an essential component of well-being for people of all ages, including elders. So the importance of storytelling is that it's one of the earliest and strongest forms of teaching and learning for all children across the whole world. But in our culture, it's been a very powerful mechanism for handing down stories, for handing down life lessons, as we've already talked about. It embeds children within an ecological framework. It's about creation and it's about sustainability, as we've already mentioned. So I know this was a very, very quick tour around some of the issues that both impact and also support our well-being. But really, what does the future hold? Well, we've got to think about how do we cradle our children safely into the future? How do we provide for them places that are safe for them to be able to rest, to recover, to be held for a while before they're ready to stand and go forward again? There's not enough sensitivity, there's not enough cultural safety as our children come into our services. So we need to get back to basics. We need to make social emotional well-being as central to development. We have an ancient knowledge system. We have a new knowledge system. There's no reason why we can't join forces. We're still using techniques for assessments of our infants and our children that are not useful and sometimes potentially harmful. We don't even use what we already know works, and that's where the narrative and the storytelling and the cultural elements are so important to be embedded in any system of care that we provide for our children. And I think everybody needs to understand how social and emotional wellbeing assists in psychological recovery, as well as in building strengths and resilience. So this is the story we'd like to tell, that once upon a time, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, in fact, all children in Australia, grew up strong and healthy and lived happily ever after. And of course, if we embed all of those strong features early in life and we really create the circumstances where social and emotional well-being can thrive in our children, then we'll have healthy, happy adults. And of course, if we do that, the nation will prosper. And the other thing is, if we include more creative elements in our services like we do in culture, then we can produce that wonder and magic for children in life. I think too often we see in our families children experiencing too many things too early in life, and they lose that ability to just feel that wonder and magic that life should hold for them. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Paul Gray. I'm a Wiradjuri man with family connections to central New South Wales. I want to acknowledge the country that I'm recording this from, Tharawal country on the outskirts of Sydney, and acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and respect for their ongoing custodianship of this country. I extend that to the custodians of the various nations that you might be joining us from today. Now, I'm going to start by assuming that we all have a general grasp on the background, that we all know the size and the shape of the challenge and its roots in settler colonialism, not just as a historical event, but as an ongoing process that produces and reproduces harm. This includes the impacts of racism, of social and economic inequality, as well as the way that these processes shape and reinforce structures through which we come to know ourselves and our relationships with others and the world. I'm also not intending to rehash the history of efforts to improve wellbeing for Aboriginal people and communities, including those associated with the first decade of closing the gap. I just want to, I suppose, reiterate 2 points that have been made by a range of advocates in this space. First, much of the discussion about much of the discussion has worked to focus the challenge of well-being in very specific ways and locate that problem in particular places. Well-being is understood as an individual challenge, and so our treatment approaches are focused on individuals. And the challenge is in Aboriginal communities, perpetuating colonial narratives of deficit, that we somehow aren't capable of taking care of ourselves and that we need the benevolent hand of settlers to guide us. That is, conversations about the well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have continued to problematise our communities, and in many ways this continues to be the case. Second, and in counter to the first, is the observation that throughout all efforts to improve well-being, to reduce the burden of health inequality, the initiatives that have tended to have the biggest impact, the ones that have worked, have been led by Aboriginal people and communities. Now, this is not surprising and is entirely consistent with theory and with all of the evidence, but oddly, it seems to surprise decision makers over and over again. ACOs, Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, have been at the forefront of positive impact for our communities, and approaches grounded in our culture, in our governance, should continue to lead the way. Having sort of set that background, I want to start with the National Agreement and with the social and emotional wellbeing target. So the target reflects a high-level aim that people enjoy high levels of social and emotional wellbeing, and specifically focuses on addressing the high rates of suicide within our communities. Sadly, things are not improving. Urgent action and investment is needed, and it should be strategically targeted to the things that work. Some of the priority actions are focused on developing that strategic approach, that strategy. And while it's essential that we get that right, so that we know that service funding is being directed to the things that work, and I would suggest include specific investment in further and ongoing research and evidence development by and for our communities, we cannot move slowly. We need to get increased support out to our communities urgently. However, the intent of today is not to talk about what should be in those strategies, but rather to look at the structures and the processes that have developed to try to help us achieve better outcomes. Now, as we mentioned at the start, a big part of the challenge here lies in the fundamental relationship between the state and Aboriginal communities. This is not a new problem. It started with the refusal to acknowledge our humanity and to enter into treaty that will frame the relationship between our peoples. The National Agreement is just one recent approach to try to found a new type of relationship. This includes the national policy partnerships, which provide a forum to discuss with governments priorities and approaches, and to advocate for governments to address persistent funding inequality and inequities produced by their systems, as well as providing a forum to focus efforts on solutions. Now, I think it's a bit early to talk about the impact of these structures, if they're working or not. So I wanted to think about what are some of the opportunities that are presented by them. And I think for me, key among those opportunities are the priority reforms. Now, as you would know, the priority reforms include formal partnership and shared decision-making, building the community-controlled sector, transforming government organisations, and shared access to data and information. And these are the conversations that I'm interested in, because there is good evidence that these broad themes are important ways, provide important ways forward for improving wellbeing. And while I'll leave the specific expertise to those who have spent more time in some of those areas, my foundations in this space have been influenced by the important work in Canada that has also looked at some of those questions. Now, I had the good fortune of meeting Professor Michael Chandler quite a few years back and hearing about his work with First Nations communities in Canada. And it's something that has remained a nagging reminder ever since. So this work started from a point of wanting to understand the problem better. And look, straight off the bat, I think that's always a pretty good place to start. And I remember him talking about kind of the Canadian government being faced with an apparent crisis of suicide of First Nations youth, decided to invest in communities to implement solutions. And look, on the surface, at a superficial level, you know, that's not a bad approach. But when they looked deeper, this was poorly directed, because it just offered each community the same bucket of funding to address the problem. And for some communities, that was really welcome. For others, though, he described that the community hadn't had any instances of suicide for a long time, and so they couldn't do anything with that investment. Meanwhile, other communities were so deeply affected that the funds wouldn't even go close to meeting their needs. And so he talked about the actuarial fictions in the way data was presented and understood. They noticed that high-level state and national figures told a misleading story. It painted all First Nations with the same brush, which meant that it hid important diversity between communities. And it framed all First Nations as being beset by the same social and economic issues that I will point out are constructed and inflicted and reinforced by settler systems and their policies that span generations. And yet these narratives were somehow framed in a way that created this idea that there was a general deficit or dysfunction inherent in Aboriginal communities, in First Nations communities. And they found that presenting the data in this way didn't actually do a good job of representing any of those communities. It didn't recognise that this issue affected different communities differently. And so they looked, what they wanted to do was look at, well, what is the difference across those communities? And does this help us better understand the issue that we're trying to address? And so they started looking at those differences. And importantly, not at the level of individual young people, but at the level of communities. And they found a number of key elements across communities that were associated with the incidence of harm, which they described collectively as cultural continuities. And I'm sure many of you have heard this story before. That is, those communities that achieved a measure of self-governance, and particularly the representation of women in local community governance, that had litigated for the title to their lands and were able to enjoy connection to their country, that had local control over services, health services, education, policing, child welfare, and had been able to develop community infrastructure and processes to preserve and enjoy and pass on their culture, tended to have better youth wellbeing and tended to have a much lower incidence of youth suicide. And so they observed that adolescence is a developmental period of personal and cultural continuity, of coming to understand identity, of place and future. And this could be particularly challenging when, quote, the cultural backcloth against which development automatically unfolds is unravelled by social cultural adversities. These community level factors and these community level factors, this cultural continuity, serve to protect young people from those adversities. And so from this work, they offered two conclusions, which I will quote. First, generic claims about youth suicide rates for the whole of any Aboriginal world are at best actuarial fictions that obscure critical community by community differences in the frequency of such deaths. Second, individual and cultural continuity are strongly linked, such that First Nations communities that succeed in taking steps to preserve their heritage and culture and that work to control their own destinies are dramatically more successful in insulating their youth against the risks of suicide. And culture is clearly at the heart of those protective factors, and it led them to observe that First Nations communities, quote, that enjoy more substantial ties to their cultural past and collective future also experience youth suicide rates that are vanishing to absent. And this program of work has led to, I think, what is one of my favorite passages in all of academic literature. It's a long one, and so apologies. And some of you may have heard it before, including from myself. But it's so well presented, it's so well written that I think it deserves to be repeated often. And so Chandler and colleagues wrote, the particular spot where the consequences of such admittedly socio-cultural matters are standardly imagined to come to roost is somewhere secreted away in the troubled hearts and minds of single individuals. Consequently, whenever we are moved to minister to such trouble, the usual impulse, the common intervention or treatment strategy, is to somehow buck up the flagging spirits of those singular symptom bearers who are counted as most disheartened or undone. Picking away at such troubles one patient at a time, we counsel and drug them, we bolster their flagging self-esteem, and otherwise do whatever seems appropriate to shore up their supposed personal shortcomings. In short, while many of our ills are acknowledged to sometimes be social or cultural in origin, when moved to intervene, Western society has customarily proceeded by attempting to redeem one lost soul at a time. A prime example of this individualistic approach to treatment is to be found in standard responses to the so-called epidemic of suicides ascribed to the residents of many Indigenous communities. Those individuals somehow deemed to be at special risk are taken aside and variously bucked up, all in the hope of somehow making each one of them personally better adjusted or less forlorn. This chapter will work to make the case that such applications of so-called individualized medical models of suicide prevention are mistaken at every turn, insisting instead that cultural wounds require cultural medicines. Now that's taken from a textbook that they contributed to, and I recommend it. It's a fantastic chapter, and that's the kind of lead into the chapter. But it lines up really well with that existing evidence. And for example, Cornell and Colt, researchers in the United States, made clear not just that self-governance is simply one policy setting associated with improved outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, well, for Indigenous peoples. It's the only one that's ever worked. And we see this spirit reflected in the priority reforms, if governments are bold enough to realise them. So we see formal partnership and shared decision-making provides a foundation for community control of their collective futures. We see calls for equitable and needs-based investment through community-controlled organisations, helping to build that local control of key services. Related, transformation of government organisations is, in my view, directed to addressing the entrenched racism present within those systems, as evidenced by the poorer outcomes that they achieve for Aboriginal service users and communities. And shared access to data and information is about local control, addressing those actuarial fictions of taking too broad a brush in understanding these challenges. Having access to good local data is a key element of good governance, informing and enabling community decision-making, community control of their collective futures. But there are challenges, and these are particularly relevant to the policy partnerships. And I think I want to start with the most obvious one, and that is simply this. Governments are terrible at sharing power. Command and control is what they do, particularly, I think, when it comes to First Nations. This has been the history of our relationship from the very beginning and remains a key site of tension. And I don't think I have to say much about that, both in terms of government, but also our society more generally at this point in time, in this year, right? Wherever one stands on the question of the voice, the debate, I think, has made abundantly clear that there is discomfort within our society in enabling Aboriginal people to shape decisions that affect us. And while shared decision-making is supposed to be, the guiding order of the day, I'm yet to be convinced that this will actually be the case. I've been in too many conversations with government that are better characterised still as consultative. And we'll need to work hard to keep the pressure on so that there is genuine change to that relationship, that we can move from consultation and participation to partnership and self-determination. And as someone who spends all their time in child protection systems and practice, I know how frustrating it is that we're still having this conversation. Bringing them home said way back in 1997, and I know that there have been conversations even before that, back into the 70s and into the 30s, that the way forward is for governments to provide resources and other supports for the implementation of approaches determined by Aboriginal communities. And yet, here we still are having that same conversation, with governments still tightly controlling the reins through budgets, through funding decisions, and through contracting parameters. So unless governments can actually genuinely shift their processes and enable local decision-making, I think the goals that we've set for ourselves are unlikely to be achieved. Now, again, I think it's too early to tell in this process. For many of the policy partnerships, there has only been a single meeting. So the conversation has only just started. The conversations that I've been a part of have been approached in good faith by all parties. And I think everyone is genuine in wanting to improve outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. But as our history shows, getting better outcomes isn't a matter of good intentions. I think the challenge is to hold governments to that line of shared decision-making as a minimum standard. I think part of the challenge too is that we are all mindful that the solutions we propose have to empower communities, not impose upon them. We want to foster innovation and community-led solutions. So even conversations around co-design make me nervous. I prefer to focus on ensuring our communities have the tools and the resources they need and then letting them get on with the job. This isn't about picking interventions and rolling them out everywhere, but supporting community processes to develop the solutions that will work for them. However, I also think that that is a really exciting part of the opportunity, as it means we will have this diverse approach that will help us develop a really rich evidence base that we can all benefit from. If everyone does the same thing, then we only learn about that one thing. By having locally led approaches, we have the opportunity for all of these natural experiments across the country that can inform communities as they continually improve their services and their systems. I'm also uncomfortable with within these conversations about the way issues continue to be framed. So we talk about the need to build the community-controlled sector, and we talk about transforming government services, but often in limited ways that reflect and recreate the problems rather than moving to solutions. So with respect to our ACOs and their so-called capacity, the problem is often framed as our communities lacking, or as a lack or a failing of our communities. And this again perpetuates views of deficit, but it ignores government's own funding inequities. To be really clear, the need to strengthen Aboriginal community control, the Aboriginal community controlled sector, is a direct result of discriminatory policy settings that have directed investment to non-Indigenous approaches and non-Indigenous organisations. Our calls to better align investment to need is not about seeking preferential treatment for Aboriginal communities, but seeking to end existing discrimination that shortchanges Aboriginal people. Similarly, I worry that transformation of government services will not go far enough and will detract from the need to shift system design and delivery to communities themselves. Child protection is a key example. I remain unconvinced that settler child protection systems can ever be made culturally safe for Aboriginal children. I'm open to being convinced, but as far as I can see, the best we can hope for is to make them less culturally unsafe. External decisions imposed on us about the best interests of our kids will always be unsafe. And so it's really important that while we transform government systems to be less unsafe, we need to keep in mind that we can't lose focus on the need to transfer those systems into the hands of our communities. There remain challenges around access to data as well, which, as I said, is a critical issue, given that useful local data is key to understanding what's happening. You know, as we saw in that example from Professor Chandler, and I don't think many people would dispute that here in Australia, government data systems don't always do a good job of representing our communities. But we need this if we're going to shape solutions and know if those solutions have worked. So I think we have some significant work to do at the outset to build First Nations data infrastructure that collects the data our communities need and puts it into their hands for good decision making. And finally, as the social and emotional wellbeing model makes clear, we need to take a holistic approach. We need to make sure that SUB initiatives are embedded across all of the other, policy partnerships in health and education, in justice, in early childhood, in child protection. Having the various policy partnerships does allow us to focus on key systems, but we have to be careful to make sure that they are well coordinated. Otherwise, we are at risk of replicating the siloed structure of governments that we're trying to fix. Now, this is something that has been consistently raised by Aboriginal members of the policy partnerships that I've been in, and certainly also acknowledged by government members. And so it's definitely front of mind in those conversations. One of the strategies we are taking is to make sure that the chairs across the policy partnerships speak to each other regularly, and also that there is regular communication across the whole of the policy partnerships, communiques and reporting. Again, I think it's early days, but it is definitely something we are focused on to make sure there is that coordination of services, that we take a holistic approach and don't fall into the trap of silos. So, you know, those are some of my reflections from being involved in the policy partnerships that are a part of the national agreement. I think that they are a key opportunity, and that's what I've chosen to focus on, because it is early days. But I know that our communities, and certainly that extends to members of the policy partnership and our peaks and CAPO more generally, are very aware of the fact that we can't take a long time to see results. And so we keep these challenges front of mind, and we keep the pressure on to make sure there is a genuine change in how decisions are made, to make sure that we are truly directing funding and investment to where it is needed at our communities, that we're supporting that with good quality data that is in the hands of our communities, and that we're transforming government organisations to address existing racism, address existing discrimination within those systems, to make them as culturally safe as possible, or as least culturally unsafe as possible, depending on one's view, but keeping that focus on how we truly transform and transfer these important systems into the hands of our communities, because we know when our communities control these systems and are able to shape them, there are better outcomes for our kids and our families and our communities' well-being. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Marshall Watson, and I'm a child and adolescent forensic psychiatrist. I'm a Noongar man from the southwest of WA, and I'll be joining you virtually today, and I'm sorry I couldn't make it there in person. Firstly, wanted to acknowledge the lands that we're meeting on today that are far and wide, and also to acknowledge the Indigenous people in the room, but also elders past, present and future and emerging. I also wanted to acknowledge that the people that we work with and those with lived experience, and these people who work with people with lived experience and who you may have within your families. Okay, so what I'm going to talk today about is really about the mental health of our young people in custody in the justice system. I want to talk predominantly overall looking at both civil and criminal matters, and we'll sort of see along the way how you'll sort of follow it as we go along. Okay. So what do we know? We know that we have an overrepresentation of our young people and just in general from offenders and for those who are victims of crime. We know that there is significant comorbidity and neurocognitive issues, and we know there's a significant overlap with child protection. What we're doing though, and what we need to be mindful of, is that we actually we're imprisoning traumatized, developmentally compromised and disadvantaged young people, where imprisonment itself adds to the re-traumatization and complexity of supporting rehabilitation and recovery. So it's not straightforward stuff. There's multiple layers to young people, the mental health of young First Nations young people in the justice system. Okay. So let's take a step back, because we are still operating in a space of colonisation. We know that colonisation has historically had the erosion and denial of the rights of First Nations people and young people, but also there's further erosion of the First Nations people's ways of knowing, being and doing. And this has resulted in an effect of the current levels of misunderstanding, mislabeling and criminalisation of First Nations young people. All too often, I've heard young people's stories that have been misheard, they've been misdiagnosed, and they've been mistreated. Okay. Also, there's the placement of First Nations young people within a broader society of hypocrisy, oppression, racism and discrimination, given the massacres, dispossession and forcible removal of children with little recourse to colonial justice at the time. This intergenerational trauma and poor health and mental health outcomes, with high rates of child removal, incarceration, poverty and offending behaviour, which is what we're seeing today. And this is the legacy that I'm talking about now. Adding on to that people who come into contact with the health and justice system also experience high levels of racism and re-traumatization within the system. We know that institutional racism is there. We know that it is a key factor to contributing to the health disparities of our people, and it results in unfair and inferior assessment and treatment. But it's also, more importantly, a deterrent to accessing healthcare engagement with police and legal services. The two systems that have historically been really difficult for Indigenous people and outright cruel in some regards have been mental health systems, but also the police and legal system as well. Adding into this the level of trauma, where intergenerational and current trauma within the historical context of genocide and the ongoing issues of generational poverty, social disadvantage and discrimination are all associated with an increased risk of First Nations people coming into contact with the justice system. Offending behaviours lie at the end of this continuum of risk, and partly as a failure of previous systems to identify, support and intervene effectively. Hence, the focus on prevention and early intervention needs to be strengthened to stop the development of pathways into offending behaviour. However, for those that are already within the system, we need to have a comprehensive understanding of the wellbeing needs of a person to be considered if an effective rehabilitation and healing approach is to be developed, fully resourced and implemented. If we're going to do it, we've got to do it properly. For our young people and Indigenous people in general, as a result of the legacies of trauma, of colonisation and the high rates of trauma, we have higher rates of risk and emotional behavioural difficulties, exposure to risk factors and stressful life events, rates of suicide, hospitalisation admissions for mental health problems, and also young people and Indigenous people in general, when they present to hospital, it's generally end stage or in crisis, and families have been holding a significant burden of disease before they actually get to that. We've got high rates of incarceration, but also removal and young people in child protection as well, and not always with kinship or Indigenous-based placements. So what is it about these young people that make that they're actually carrying? Remember, these are young people who should have be able to be kids, and they actually haven't had a chance to be able to do that in a way that we would all want and hope for them. With trauma, they become really hyper vigilant. They scan the environment. They're in a survival mode. They become disinhibited, they dysregulate, and they don't really care about social norms because of a way of trying to protect themselves. They see the world through a lens of fear, confusion, and mistrust. They're just trying to survive. But also, more importantly, is that whilst we may see someone come across someone who is, say, an example of 14 years of age chronologically, if they've had a traumatic event that hasn't been addressed or treated or intervened with or disclosed at the age of, say, 7, they're going to be stuck in their trauma in that developmental age of 7 rather than the chronological age of 14. But again, may have a lived experience of someone much older because they've probably got parents with mental health issues or issues around capacity of parenting. And it may be that these young people are actually looking after their own parents, but also looking after their own younger brothers and sisters. And then we expect them to go to school. We expect them to try and get through the normal tasks of adolescence. So it is really quite a complex experience for a young person with trauma and trying to navigate that with their own sort of stuff going on versus about what they're trying to deal with versus what society puts onto them as well, in the way of trying to get them some help. Because what we have to remember with trauma is that all behaviour is communication, and that is emotionally based. And that emotionally based response is related to a stage of emotional development at which trauma occurred. Young people don't like feeling awful. I think the predominant issue that we need to really realise is that a lot of people that we see with trauma in the criminal justice system, who are victims or offenders or whatever, they've all got untreated anxiety. And that anxiety stems from an early life experience of where there's been caregiver inconsistency and fear. And because they feel really anxious and they don't know how to deal with it, they don't like feeling like that. So what they do is they develop maladaptive coping strategies to try and not feel anxious or awful. And that comes across as suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, self-harm, substance misuse, externalizing behaviors, which gets them into trouble to try and deal with the trauma, which is a very maladaptive way because it gets in the way of them actually just being teenagers and young people. And they live in complex environments. They bounce between a highly emotive environment, sometimes of family, but also out-of-home care and custody. It depends what their life stage is. Are they chronologically one age, developmentally one age, and we're putting other expectations on them? But they also live in two worlds that don't always agree, from a white fella way and a black fella way. Furthermore, from a cultural point of view, there is probably going to be an element of cultural disconnection. And then when they are trying to engage with people, they don't really know how to engage people relationally. And this is where it comes into problem. It can come into where things run into trouble when they try to help treat these young people. Because with young people with trauma and grown up in traumatic environments, there is safety in chaos. They grow up in highly dysregulated environments where there's lack of caregiver consistency. They have emotional and behavioural issues, and they're really dysregulated and really scared. And that's kind of what they're used to. And then when they come into, say, custody or a therapeutic setting, firstly, it's a confined environment. If we take custody as an example, and they kick off even more because that we've taken away the chaos of their norm. It's kind of like the anecdote that I use is that it's like putting someone who doesn't have trauma into a traumatic environment. It goes both ways. They're both distressing for each people for different reasons. But because these young people have grown up with experiencing adults and adult relationships or family relationships that are unsafe or not modeled properly for their own reasons of intergenerational trauma, this isn't about blame, this is about context and understanding, is that they don't know how to use adults, they don't know how to navigate personal relationships. So when we put them into contact with a service, we're trying to help them, but they don't actually know how to navigate relationships culturally or otherwise. So they find that really difficult. But then we go and put all these services on certain people to make them feel better because we've got to see them from a child protector, like take a kid in custody or the justice system. They're going to have justice obligations, legal obligations, court appearances, mental health, drug and alcohol. They just get oversaturated with services and they just disengage because it's just all too much. Because being normal, whatever that is actually really hard. So it's the environment that they live in, but also the environment that we try and place on them to help them get better. And the healthcare experience for young people isn't always great because these young people have independent silos who manage within their own remit and they don't talk to each other. Police are about community protection, mental health's about mental health, child protection is about keeping kids safe, drug and alcohol is stop using drugs, so forth and so on. But they don't have their own little remit, but they don't have a SUB remit. Okay, so that's where the issue lies. But this fragmentation actually makes the trauma worse. It reinforces the dynamics of trauma, isolation, disconnection, re-traumatization, and disempowerment. And this lack of cohesion is incredibly culturally unsafe because it's lots of services, different people to talk to, different story to tell someone to, and keeping on telling that story is also really quite traumatizing. And people get really overwhelmed and they just go, no, and they vote with their feet. So that's the healthcare. We're going to put on, if we put in the layer of the legal system from a criminal and a civil point of view, the legal system is a legacy of government policies. People may not actually engage as a victim, or they don't do as much, or they just don't engage at all. There's a significant emotional cost for someone coming forward as a victim because it's around, whilst they want justice, they need to have proof to do so. So that one doesn't always lead to the other. And there is this issue about if they do disclose, if we take an example of sexual abuse and people coming forward for that, is it feels really shame for them. They can feel shamed by the process and they can feel shamed by court and also families, particularly those of offenders and and if they're within their own families as well, because naming someone saying they did wrong way story or wrong way stuff you need to be really brave to do that because there can be repercussions. So there's a lot of things we need to hold for people for them to come forward to do this. And also the fact that if we look at offenders have also likely been victims as well. So people who commit sexual offences have also probably been a victim of sexual offence. However, what I have come to learn from speaking with various lawyers and so forth is even the chance to tell their story, whether or not there is justice or not, is it can be very, very healing, and where things can start to be made right. How courts deal with young offenders can be very important about a young person's prospect of rehabilitation. If it's harsh or procedurally unfair from a sentencing or custodial authority, this could reinforce a defiant reaction for young people that it actually aims to treat. So interventions that can strike early, are intensive and appropriate across all domains can be highly effective, but we need to see this from a trauma-informed point of view. Okay. So what is the frame of reference if we're actually looking at how we actually work with Indigenous people and particularly young people? Rather than all too often seeing their issues as addressing a criminogenic need, let's take a step back and look at the person. From an individual's point of view, a young person's about what are we actually going to do to help with their personal controls? How are we going to enhance their cultural resilience? How are we going to connect them to culture? How are we going to get them through school or get them a job? How are we going to increase their role in the community and within the family? And then looking at the family, we've got to stop working just with people, young people, we've got to work with their families. Let's look at the system. Let's look at kinship. Let's look at the protective people and the family measures and the cultural connection. But also, where does also this sit within a community point of view? So there's multiple layers of how we actually intervene and work with young people. We've actually got to have yes, we have to have a trauma-informed approach. We have to have an Indigenous way of doing as well. And where's the evidence base for that? Well, the evidence is here. If we look at the Chamberlin and Allende studies, which was done probably close to over 2, if not 3 decades ago, where does culture sit within suicide prevention? What Chamberlin and Allende found with First Nations Canadian youth were high rates of suicide, significant variations across different communities. But what they did find interesting is that where there was a cultural continuity factor, whether that be government, land claims, education, health, cultural facilities, police and fire services, where they were present, suicide rates were lower. So it was like, oh, okay, if we've got one cultural continuity factor, great. But what if we've actually got multiple? The more factors of cultural continuity and cultural ways of doing things, the lower your rates of suicide. So culture is protective. So we've actually got to start using our ways of doing and bringing that in. We all know it. We all know that services know it, but I think they struggle to operationalize them. So what does that mean? So if we take a step back, if we're going to work with young people, whether they be victims, offenders, in out-of-home care, whatever, we've got to take a step back, and it's about First Nation traditional views, beliefs and practices. We've got to learn from history. We've got to get in touch with the contemporary stuff. We've got to look at our gaps in knowledge, and we have to think about our potential pathways for recovery across each dimension. Whatever we do as a service, as Aboriginal people, and working with services, is we've got to be safe. We've got to be trustworthy and transparent to services, but also culturally and community. We need to be supporting our peers and having them support us. We have to be collaborative and working with. It's about mutuality. It's about empowering people. It's not about reducing risk. Yes, it is about reducing risk. I much prefer the term of let's empower someone, okay? Rather than making them resilient, which I think, we're a bit past resilience. We want empowerment. Young people have to have voice and choice, as do families. And whatever we do, we have to see it through an understanding of historical, gender, and cultural issues. So with a little bit of a deeper dive, because we know that Indigenous ways of doing and making meaning of stuff is based on our own strengths. It's about endurance. We've survived. We're resilient. So pardon the term, it should rather the word empowerment be there. It's about inclusiveness and compassion. It's about being sharing and being reciprocal. Historically, we've had secure attachment and relationships. They're still there. We've got to just bring them back to the forefront. It's about autonomy and self-reliance. It's about humor and creativity. It's about our knowledge, what's ancient, what's new, but also what is continuous. That is what we bring to the game here, okay, and to making change. So we've got our ways of doing and knowing, but whatever we do, we've got to be making sure that whatever knowledge we bring to the table is protected. We have to be really mindful about data sovereignty. How do we use our knowledge to affect change for Indigenous people? And what is data versus sovereignty versus governments? And the governance is the important one. Well, they're all important, but it's about, if we're going to use cultural knowledge to do something, then how do we use that knowledge to make an intervention or do something different? But then if it's not working, how do we revisit that knowledge and use that knowledge of what's working, what's not, to do things differently? We've got to own the data. Okay, I think that's a really important point of how we do it. Services. They need to be consulting with people, families and community, delivering programs that are relevant to the needs of First Nations young people, and they need to be continuously developed and overseen and established with a sufficiently funded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Committee or Cultural Governance Group, There needs to reflect the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures, and health has to be considered at all levels of governance. We've got to have a highly visible Indigenous workforce, and we've got to be collecting data on our workforce as well, because we want to be not only recruiting, but retaining, but growing our workforce by investing in them. How we design services, again, it's a little bit of previous, but it's about Indigenous knowledge and ways of doing. We've got to be mindful of the legacy of colonisation and racism and discrimination. It is about, we've got to be mindful of trauma in the healthcare and the legal system as well. We need to be doing co-design and consultation with cultural governance, and data sovereignty has to be considered across the board. We've got to think about our workforce. We've got to be growing our workforce, investing them, because it's not just about giving someone a job. It's about investing in them and developing them and growing them, because they can go home and then they're a role model for their family and as well. So there's multiple layers of that, and we need to be working for a real advocacy of cultural change in the system. We know the knowledge, we've done lots of studies, we've had lots of stuff looked at, and there's a lot of reports that sit on shelves of gathering dust. It's about taking the next step to actually incorporating that knowledge, which people I think want to do, but they don't know how to do it in a way that reflects data sovereignty, cultural governance, and how to really operationalize a social and emotional wellbeing framework that is built from a grassroots level. We have to work collectively to move forward to repair. Generally speaking, with young people, with services, how do we do things differently? How do we work better with the mental health services? How do we work better with the legal system? I think there's a lot of really good, there's some really, it's a very positive view at the moment about how people want to do things differently from a legal and mental health point of view. They just don't know how to do it. And that's where we have to work together, okay? We need to all be brave. We need to have courage. We need to stand strong together and acknowledge the space we're in for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We've got to look at cultural stuff being right way. We've got to think about law versus law, LORE versus LAW. We need leaders. We need followers. More as importantly as well, but also more so we need tolerance and compassion. And it's time to pivot. Another one of those COVID terms, which I'm sure everyone's probably sick of by now, but we need to move beyond tokenism. We need to engage, support and grow our Indigenous workforce. What we do with and for Indigenous people needs to have an appropriate governance structure. We need to be thinking about how we use our knowledge and how it's kept safe, but how it is useful to the young people that we're working with. And the programs that need to be strength-based, trauma-focused, and focus on healing and empowerment. Okay, now that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for your time. Take from it what you will. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person, and I hope to have a chance to meet all of you in some place and space in the future. Thank you.
Well, we've come to the end of our program for today. Thank you for staying the course, and I hope you've really enjoyed the presentations. I know personally, on behalf of myself, I'd like to thank Catherine and Paul and Marshall for their excellent presentations. And I hope that you will really join us again as we develop further webinars in the future. I just want to thank all of the presenters for their insights, their research and their commitment to improving the outcomes for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities, and in particular for our children. Thank you, everyone.